There is something curious about this story. It begins with a fall, but it does not end on the ground. It begins with loss, but it does not end in forgetfulness. Asterisk, and the strangest part of all, the main character did absolutely nothing to change his own destiny. No achievements, no proof of worth, no attempt to get up. Asterisk, in fact, when everything begins, he is hidden, forgotten, living in a place where no important person would step. Asterisk A place called Lo-Debar. But one day, in the center of power, on the throne of Israel, a king asks a question that no one expected. Is there still anyone? Asterisk, and that question crosses the kingdom, crosses the distance, crosses the forgetfulness. Asterisk, until it reaches the name of a man who had practically been erased from history. Asterisk, his name is Mephibosheth, a man marked by the fall, limited in his own feet, without position, without expectation, without an apparent future. And even so, he was called by the king. Now think with me. Asterisk, why would a powerful king look for someone who had nothing to offer? Asterisk, why bring to the palace someone who grew up in forgetfulness? Asterisk, and why place at the table someone that society itself did not value? The answer to this story is not in the strength of Mephibosheth. Asterisk, it is in the heart of the king. And when you understand that, everything changes. Asterisk, at that time, Israel was living days of transition. Dangerous days. Asterisk, the first king of the nation, Saul, had fallen in battle. Asterisk, alongside him, his son Jonathan had also died, a man known not only for his courage, but for his loyalty, especially to David. The news of the death was not just a family tragedy, it was a political earthquake. Asterisk, because at that time, when a king died, it was not only the throne that became empty. Asterisk, his entire house was at risk. Asterisk, the succession of power in Israel was not peaceful. There were no elections. There were no guaranteed peaceful agreements. There was fear. There were disputes. Asterisk, and many times there was blood. Asterisk, any descendant of the house of a previous king could be seen as a threat to the new government. Asterisk, and it is in this scenario that we find a boy. His name was Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, grandson of Saul, someone who, by birth, carried royal blood. Asterisk, but who, at that moment, had no idea what was about to happen. Asterisk, he was only 5 years old enough to run, to play. Asterisk, but not to understand the weight of the news that was about to fall upon his life. Asterisk, when the information reached the palace. Asterisk, there was no time for explanations. There was no time for goodbyes. The reaction was immediate. Asterisk, his nurse, the woman responsible for taking care of him, fell into despair. Asterisk, she knew what that news meant. Asterisk, she knew what usually happened to descendants of defeated kings. Asterisk, and moved by fear, she made a quick decision to flee. Maybe she thought she was saving the boy's life. Asterisk, maybe she was right. But not every escape ends as planned. In the rush, in the tension, in the chaos of that moment, something went wrong. While trying to escape, carrying the child in her arms, she fell. And in that instant, without warning, without choice, without return, Mephibosheth's life changed forever. Asterisk. Fall was not only physical. Asterisk it was the end of a future that seemed guaranteed. Asterisk his feet were compromised. Asterisk the Bible is direct. He became crippled in both feet. Asterisk a boy who was born into royalty. Asterisk now would carry a mark for the rest of his life, a visible limitation, a constant reminder of that day. Asterisk, and maybe you can imagine what that meant in that culture. Asterisk at that time. Physical strength was not just an advantage. It was survival. It was dignity. It was identity. And suddenly, Mephibosheth loses all of that before even growing up. But the fall was only the beginning, because the danger had not yet passed. The threat still existed, and the question that remained in the air was inevitable. Asterisk, what happens to someone marked by the fall? In a world that eliminates the weak, the answer begins to reveal itself in the place where he was taken. A place called Lo-Debar. And that is where the story takes us now, after the fall. Came the silence. Mephibosheth was not taken to a new palace. He was not hidden in some strategic place. He was taken far away, very far, to a place called Lo-Debar, a name that, by itself, already said a lot. Asterisk in the language of that time. Lo-Debar carried the idea of something without value, asterisk, without pasture, without productive life. It was a forgotten place, dry, distant from the centers of power. Asterisk, distant from decisions. Asterisk, distant from hope. There was no prestige there. There was no recognition. There was no visible future. And that is exactly where a descendant of royalty is taken. Asterisk, do you see the contrast? Asterisk a boy who is born in the center of power. Asterisk now grows up on the margins of history, and time passes. The years go by. Asterisk and Mephibosheth grows in that environment, not as a prince, but as someone who learns to survive. The Bible does not describe every detail of his life there, but the context speaks for itself. Asterisk, a man with physical limitations. Asterisk in a land without resources, without influence, without a voice, and more than that, carrying a name that could be dangerous. Asterisk, because he was not just another man. Asterisk, he was from the house of Saul. Asterisk, and that, at that time, was not exactly an advantage. Asterisk, it was a risk. Asterisk, it was the kind of identity that made someone live with caution. Asterisk, without drawing attention, without exposing himself, always one step behind, always in silence. Now think for a moment. Asterisk, how many times in the history of Israel were names erased because of power disputes? Asterisk, how many lineages disappeared without leaving traces? Asterisk, Mephibosheth had every reason to believe he would be just another one, just another forgotten, just another left behind, just another that history would never mention again. And maybe, over the years, he accepted that. Asterisk, maybe he learned not to expect anything, not to dream of restoration, not to imagine change. Asterisk, because Lo-Debar was not just a physical place. Asterisk, it was a condition. It was a state of existence, a place where people simply remained. Asterisk, but while Mephibosheth was living in forgetfulness. Asterisk, something was happening somewhere else, in the center of Israel, on the throne. Asterisk, the man who now ruled the nation was not just any king, it was David. There was something inside him that time had not erased. A covenant, a promise, asterisk a commitment that had not died with Jonathan. Asterisk and one day, without warning, without any expectation from anyone in Lo-Debar. Asterisk. The king asked a question. Asterisk a question that would begin to change everything. Asterisk, is there still anyone from the house of Saul? Asterisk, and it is exactly this question that breaks the silence of the story. In Jerusalem, in the center of power, in the heart of the kingdom, the king speaks. David was not at war at that moment. Asterisk. He was not being pressured by enemies. There was no crisis demanding urgent decisions. Even so, something moved him. A memory. A covenant, asterisk, a promise made many years before. With Jonathan. Asterisk. And then, unexpectedly, David asks a question that no one was expecting. Asterisk. Is there still anyone from the house of Saul, that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Pause for a moment. This was not a common question for a king. Asterisk, in the political logic of that time, this did not make sense. Kings did not look for descendants of previous dynasties to bless them. Kings eliminated threats. Kings consolidated power. Kings protected the throne. But David did not. He was not being guided by fear. He was being guided by faithfulness. Faithfulness to a covenant. Faithfulness to a word. Asterisk, and that changes everything. Asterisk, because when a king decides to act based on covenant, even the forgotten begin to be searched for. The answer to David's question did not take long. Asterisk, there was indeed someone. Asterisk, a servant from the house of Saul, named Ziba, was brought before the king. Asterisk, and before David, he confirmed. Asterisk, there is still a son of Jonathan, crippled in both feet. Asterisk, notice how Mephibosheth is described, not by his name, not by his lineage, but by his limitation. That is how he was known. That is how he was seen. His condition had become his identity. Asterisk, but for David, that was not the most important thing. So the king asks another question. Where is he? Asterisk, and the answer reveals the full scenario. He is in Lo-Debar, the place of forgetfulness. Asterisk, the place where nothing grows. Asterisk, the place where stories do not move forward. But on that day, the silence of Lo-Debar would be interrupted. Asterisk, because David did not just ask, he acted. The text is direct. The king sent for him. Now imagine the scene. Asterisk, royal. Messengers leaving Jerusalem, crossing lands until they arrive at that forgotten place. And there, finding a man who probably was not expecting to be found. A man who was not preparing for a calling. A man who was not expecting restoration. Asterisk, but when the king calls, it does not matter where you are. Not even Lo-Debar can hide someone. Asterisk. And the question that now hangs in the air is inevitable. What goes through the mind of a man like Mephibosheth when he discovers that the king is calling for him? Asterisk. Would this be the end? Asterisk, or the beginning of something he never imagined. Asterisk, the answer begins to reveal itself. On the way to Jerusalem. Asterisk, the journey from Lo-Debar to Jerusalem was not just geographical. It was emotional. It was spiritual. Asterisk, it was the kind of path that shakes everything inside someone. Asterisk, Mephibosheth was being taken to meet the king, not by his own choice, not by his own initiative, but because he was called. And that alone already raises an inevitable question. Asterisk, what did he expect to find? Asterisk, because, in the logic of that time, asterisk, to be called by a king, being a descendant of a previous dynasty, rarely ended well. Asterisk, every step toward Jerusalem could feel heavier. Asterisk, every thought more tense. Maybe memories came to mind. His grandfather, Saul. Asterisk, his father, Jonathan. Both dead. Both directly connected to the man who now occupied the throne, David. And now, this same king wanted to see him. Asterisk, there was no way to ignore the weight of that. Asterisk, when he finally arrives at the palace. Asterisk, Mephibosheth is brought before the king, not as a prince, not as an heir, asterisk, but as someone who did not know what to expect. Asterisk, and then he enters. Asterisk, the environment is different. Nothing reminds him of Lo-Debar. There is order. There is authority. There is presence. The king is there. And in that moment, asterisk, Mephibosheth does the only thing that made sense. Asterisk, he bows down, face to the ground, a posture of total submission. Asterisk, a posture that recognizes authority, but also reveals fear. And then something happens. The king speaks, but not as a judge, not as an enemy. He calls him by name, Mephibosheth, not son of Saul, not crippled, not threat. Asterisk, he calls by name, and that changes the tone of the story, because when someone is called by name, asterisk, there is recognition, there is intention, there is something personal. Asterisk, Mephibosheth's response is short, direct, and revealing. Here is your servant. There is no defense. There is no argument. There is no attempt to justify anything, only surrender. But what comes next, no one could predict. David says, "Do not fear." Asterisk, these words in that context are powerful because they mean you will not be destroyed. You will not be eliminated. You do not need to run. But the king does not stop there. He continues, asterisk, I will show you kindness. For the sake of Jonathan, your father. Now everything begins to make sense. It was not about politics. It was not about threat. It was about covenant. Asterisk, a promise made in the past, now being fulfilled in the present. And then restoration comes. Asterisk, I will restore to you all the good land of Saul your father. Asterisk, in an instant, a man who had nothing receives back inheritance, identity, history. Asterisk, but it is not over yet. Asterisk, David says something even deeper. Asterisk, and you shall eat bread at my table. Always, always. Not once, not occasionally, but continuously. This is not just provision. It is inclusion. It is honor. It is relationship. Asterisk, Mephibosheth, still bowed down, responds with words that reveal how he saw himself. Asterisk, what is your servant, that you should look upon such a dead dog as I am? This is not just a phrase, is a reflection of years in Lo-Debar. Asterisk of a broken identity, of someone who did not see himself as worthy. But the king does not respond with correction. Asterisk, he responds with action, and on that day, without merit, without achievement, without personal effort. Asterisk, Mephibosheth leaves the condition of forgotten. Asterisk 2. The position of someone who sits at the king's table. Asterisk, but, like every real story, asterisk, there would still be tests. Asterisk, because not everyone around saw this restoration. In the same way, asterisk, and what seemed resolved would still be put to the test. From that day on, everything changed for Mephibosheth. He did not return to Lo-Debar. He was not left on the margins. Asterisk, he began to live in Jerusalem, in the city of the king. And more than that, asterisk, the Bible records something that seems simple, but is deeply significant. He ate continually at the king's table, every day, like one of the king's sons. Do you see the level of this restoration? It was not just about possessions. It was not just about land. It was about position. It was about belonging. It was about grace. And here there is a silent detail, but powerful. Every time Mephibosheth sat at the table, his feet were not seen. That limitation that marked his history was hidden under the king's table, not because it ceased to exist, but because the position in which he was placed, asterisk, was greater than his limitation. Asterisk, but not everyone around was living this story with the same eyes. Asterisk, among those who surrounded the palace, there was someone who also was part of this narrative, Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul. Asterisk, the same man who informed David about the existence of Mephibosheth. Asterisk now. He had a clear function, to manage the lands that had been restored, to work on behalf of Mephibosheth, to serve him. And, at first glance, everything seemed in order. But the biblical story rarely ignores human tensions. And what is calm is often still to be tested. Time passes, and Israel enters a new moment of crisis. Asterisk, an internal crisis, a rebellion. David's own son, Absalom, rises against his father. A painful conflict, a king fleeing from his own son. Asterisk, Jerusalem ceases to be a safe place, and David needs to leave quickly. Once again, we see a scenario of escape. Asterisk, once again, we see instability. Asterisk, once again, the kingdom is shaken, and it is in this moment that Ziba appears again. Asterisk, but this time with a different narrative. Asterisk, he goes to meet David, bringing provisions. Asterisk, and when the king asks about Mephibosheth, asterisk, the answer changes the direction of the story. Asterisk, he stayed in Jerusalem, because he said, "Today the house of Israel will restore to me the kingdom of my father." Asterisk, this accusation is serious, very serious, because it suggests betrayal. It suggests opportunism. It suggests that, in the moment of crisis, Mephibosheth turned against the king. Asterisk, and now, the question that arises is inevitable. Asterisk, did that man who received grace respond with ingratitude? Asterisk, or is there something more happening behind this version? David, at that moment, makes a quick decision, perhaps pressured by the situation, perhaps influenced by the scenario. He gives everything to Zib, the lands that had been given to Mephibosheth, now passed to him, and suddenly the story of restoration seems threatened. But the truth has not yet been fully revealed, and the reunion between the king and Mephibosheth will expose much more than words. The time of crisis passes. Absalom's rebellion comes to an end. And David returns to Jerusalem. The king returns to his place. The throne is restored. Order begins to be reestablished. But some questions were still open. And among them, the situation of Mephibosheth, that man who had been accused, the one who, according to the words of another, had betrayed. But now, there was no more distance. There were no more rumors. It was the moment of the encounter. And when Mephibosheth appears before the king, there is something that immediately draws attention. His appearance. The Bible makes a point of recording details that are not random. He had not taken care of his feet. He had not trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes. From the day the king had left until the day he returned in peace. This is not neglect. This is a sign. In that culture, these gestures were connected to mourning, affliction, humiliation. It was as if his outward condition spoke something even before his words. He was not living as someone who celebrated the fall of the king. He was living as someone who suffered with his absence. And then, before David, he finally speaks. And his answer reveals everything. He explains that he wanted to go with the king. That he tried to prepare himself. That he asked for help, but he was deceived. Ziba left him behind. And more than that. He says something that completely changes the perspective. My lord the king is like an angel of God. There is no aggressive accusation. There is no revolt. There is no demand. There is recognition. There is honor. There is submission. And then he continues. Do what seems good in your eyes. Now pause for a moment. This is not the speech of someone desperate for possessions. It is not someone trying to recover position. It is someone who already understood something deeper. And he makes that even clearer. All of my father's house were worthy of death before the king. Yet you set your servant among those who eat at your table. He recognizes the grace. He recognizes that nothing he received was deserved. And then comes the sentence that defines his heart. What right then? Do I still have to cry out to the king? This is powerful, because it reveals that, for him, the greatest gift was not the land. It was the table. It was the relationship, was the acceptance. David listens, but perhaps because of the complexity of the situation, or because of the decision already made before, he responds in a practical way. He divides the land between Mephibosheth and Ziba. Asterisk, a decision that could raise questions, could generate frustration, could provoke a reaction. Asterisk, but Mephibosheth responds in a way that removes any doubt about who he truly was. Asterisk, let him take it all. Since my lord the king has returned in peace, he lets it go. He does not argue. Asterisk, he does not fight for rights. He does not insist on his own justice. Because for him, asterisk, what truly mattered had already been restored. The king had returned, and that was enough. Asterisk, and here, the story stops being only about events, asterisk, and begins to reveal deep principles about grace, about loyalty, asterisk, about identity, asterisk, but there is still something that needs to be understood. Asterisk, because this story is not only about one man, asterisk, it points to something greater, something that crosses generations, and that continues echoing even today, asterisk. The story of Mephibosheth does not end with a dispute over land, nor with politics, nor with who ended up with more or less, asterisk. It ends with something much deeper, the table, because in the end, asterisk, this was always the greatest evidence of everything. From the beginning, when David decided to act, asterisk, it was not about rewarding performance, asterisk, it was not about merit, it was about covenant, a promise made to Jonathan that crossed time and reached someone who was not even present when it was made. Asterisk, you see that? Asterisk, Mephibosheth did nothing to earn that place. He did not fight for it. He did not prove himself worthy. Asterisk, he did not have time to build a reputation. In fact, when he was found, asterisk, he was in Lo-Debar, hidden, marked, without expectation, and even so, he was called, asterisk, and even so, he was brought, asterisk, and even so, he was restored. And more than that, he was kept, because the Bible makes it clear, he ate continually. At the king's table, it was not an isolated moment. It was not an occasional visit. Asterisk, it was a permanent position. Asterisk, and that completely changes the reading of the story. Asterisk, because it shows that grace was not just an act, it was a continuous decision. Now, think every time Mephibosheth sat at the table, no one saw his feet. Asterisk, that mark of it, fall, did not disappear, but it also no longer defined his position. Asterisk, the table covered what the fall had exposed. Asterisk, the presence of the king was greater than the limitation. And maybe this is one of the most silent and deepest messages of this story. Asterisk, because there are moments when life takes us to Lo-Debar. Asterisk, moments when something breaks, moments when the fall happens, and the marks remain visible, real, hard to ignore, but the story does not end in the fall, nor in isolation, nor in forgetfulness. Asterisk, it can change when the king decides to call, and when he calls, it is not to expose, it is to restore. It is not to remind of the fall, it is to establish a new position. Mephibosheth understood that. Asterisk, that is why he did not fight for land. That is why he did not argue for rights. That is why he could say, let him take it all, because The one who understands grace. Asterisk no. Longer lives trying to prove worth. Asterisk lives responding with. Loyalty. Asterisk and maybe. The question this story leaves is not only about him, asterisk, but about the one who is. Listening. Asterisk, if a man marked by the she, fall, forgotten in Lo-Debar, without any merit, asterisk, could be called by name, asterisk, brought into the presence of the king, asterisk, and placed at the table, asterisk, what does that say about the power of grace? And more, what does that say about the kind of king who does this kind of thing? Because in the end, the story of Mephibosheth is not only about restoration, asterisk, it is about a king who does not forget covenants, asterisk, a king who searches for the forgotten, a king who transforms destiny, and a king, asterisk, who still calls by name.